of this conference. This is there's only been 4 conferences from UNESCO on higher education. And this is the first time, I think, that the forces have coalesced to demonstrate and to acknowledge the role that higher education has in achieving all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And there are global networks here, like the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the International Association of Universities, the Association of Universities Francophonie, the regional and national university associations, and many leaders. And it's a fantastic feeling to be together, for us physically, but also with you connecting online, to really to make the case for why higher education needs proportionate funding and support in order to play its role in supporting primary and secondary, but also in solving the world's intangible global challenges. And if we think about the last 2 years, we have been going through a global pandemic, which has massively disrupted people's lives. It's been tragic, and it's also created real greater divides in education across the world. My name's Joanna Newman, and I'm the Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and our network did a survey quite early on which demonstrated that not only did the pandemic disrupt the lives of students and universities, but also many campuses were closed. Those campuses that were open, many of them were really innovative in what they did, but there was also a double divide even in those institutions where some more junior members of staff and students didn't have the access to data and technology that they needed. So we've gone through a huge amount of change in the last few years, and we've all adapted in ways that we didn't think were possible. So the question for this session today is, having gone through that time, what are the models for higher education in the future? How much disruption can we take, and how much disruption should we have if we think about the world's population? And we think that gross tertiary enrollment, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have the largest youth demographics, have the least access to tertiary education, whereas in the developed countries, they have the most access. So how can we do something about that? And this is some of the questions that I'm going to ask my exceptional panel members today. And I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to ask those in the room to come and take a seat on the stage. First of all, I'd like to introduce Cheryl de la Rey. Cheryl de la Rey is the ACU's chair, but she is also she's Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury in New Zealand, was Vice-Chancellor of Pretoria University. In total, Cheryl's had about 20 years' experience as an executive in higher education in South Africa, having served in many positions such as Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, Executive Director of the National Research Foundation, and most recently the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria before moving to New Zealand. She has a PhD in psychology and has published many chapters, edited books and journal articles. She serves on many committees, including the New Zealand Qualifications Authority and the Academic Quality for Universities New Zealand. And Cheryl's also served as an executive board member of the International Council for Science from 2014 to 18. So welcome, Cheryl. We have in the room Professor Kevin Hall, who is the 8th President and Vice-Chancellor in the University of Victoria's 57-year history. President Hall is an innovative academic leader known for his strong commitment to sustainability, innovation, community engagement, and an unwavering belief in truth, respect, and reconciliation, equitable access to education and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Throughout his career as a senior administrator working for 3 world-class institutions, Hall has served at many levels and functions at a university, from faculty member, research centre director and department chair, vice president and senior deputy vice-chancellor of global engagement and partnerships at the universities of Newcastle in New South Wales, Australia, and now as President and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Victoria. So welcome, Kevin. Right. I'd then like to welcome Professor Julian Skirm, who is hopefully joining us. Who's on our screen. I can see you, Julian. Thank you for joining us. He's the Founding Director of Social Responsibility at the University of Manchester. Manchester is unique in UK higher education for having social responsibility as one of its core goals, and currently leads the world for impact towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And Julian's role in this development has been absolutely crucial and key. Julian has 3 degrees from the University of Manchester, a BA in Political Philosophy, Economics and Social Sciences, an MA in Social Research, and a Doctor of Education in Educational Policy and Philosophy. After qualifying as a teacher, Julian spent his early career as head of social sciences and assistant vice principal at a large inner-city sixth form college, and later became the University of Manchester's first head of widening participation. And its first full-time director of social responsibility. He serves on many boards and local organisations in Manchester, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. So welcome, Julian. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome to the stage Pamela Dube, who is our Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. Pamela completed her Master's and PhD studies in Comparative Literature and Media at the University of Siegen in Germany, supported by the German exchange program DAAD, D-A-A-D. And her versatile career includes higher education research management, human resources development, institutional advancement, student affairs and international relations. She's a past senior employee of the National Department of Education and an academic at the University of Siegen in Germany, Kathmandu University in Nepal, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She's also served as a special advisor to the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Johannesburg, where she took on the leadership of human resources. She's also the co-chair for the Association of Commonwealth Universities Higher Education and SDG Network. So we thank you for that, Pamela, and welcome you also to this session. So universities, as I've said, have been through a huge amount of disruption over the last few years. And also challenge from the Black Lives Matter movement, challenge from the decolonisation, challenge about the inequities and injustice in terms of access to education across the world. But I would also start by saying that universities are perhaps not the most flexible and adaptable institutions in the world, and they do have a tendency to be steeped in tradition. There's a high degree of risk aversion, an unspoken assumption to replicate a learned elite, which might in some ways have been responsible for the fact that if we look at aid and development, most goes to primary and secondary, not to the tertiary world, because many development scientists see that as an elite occupation, which is something that we want to address and change. And they're not always well equipped to initiate transformative change. So the first question that I want to ask you is, as a change leader, how are you transforming higher education at your institution? And if I might start with you, Cheryl.
Well, greetings to everybody from Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm sitting in a very different time zone, where I'm about to end my working day as you start yours at the other end of the world. So Joanna, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's really a great privilege for me to join you at this important event. I want to start off with those comments you made about the nature of universities. And I'm sure we have heard many times people say that universities constitute one of the oldest institutional types in the world today. And yes, many people do reflect that universities are slow to change, risk averse and the like. But in fact, if we look back, there have been significant changes over the centuries, and certainly the COVID pandemic has had significant changes with many institutions across the world making huge pivots in terms of the modes of delivery that they've offered, moving from perhaps mostly in person on campus to much more hybrid forms of delivery. But at the same time, as we talk about change and the disruption of the pandemic, there have been some persistent issues across universities. And one of them really centers on two key questions. And these are questions about who enrolls at universities and who graduates. And so what I'm really drawing attention to is equity of opportunity. And equity of opportunity is not only about accessing or enrolling in universities, but also succeeding at the end of a pathway of study. And moving regions from South Africa to New Zealand, I feel that I have a basis now for making some observations about these persistent inequities. I've referred to the gaps in access of opportunity, but also the gap in educational attainment. And yes, despite some advances, let's say in gender, there are these persistent gaps. So from South Africa to New Zealand, one of the persistent inequities really maps around ethnicity and household income levels. Saw that on the African continent, and I see it here in a very different part of the world. What we also see is that in spite of good intentions and the introduction of many, perhaps sometimes customized programs, these inequities persist. So the question needs to be asked is, how do we bring about systemic change? And one of the propositions, or one of my learnings has been, in order to make significant and scalable change, we need to scrutinize the way we as a university system do things. And in fact, many of the things that we do, from how we enroll students to how we structure our classroom teaching, where we have that, how we think about the academic program and its structure, needs to be rethought, in my point of view. Because in spite of changes in the diversity of incoming students, some things have remained the hallmark of university education, such as the notion of thinking of an academic year or a semester and what that constitutes, the notion of what an undergraduate qualification looks like, how much time it needs to take. And I believe that if we are going to break this persistent inequity of access and opportunity, we need a change in the ecosystem for universities. So just some other observations. Yes, I've referred to the commonalities across regions. So what I've said about my experience in South Africa and now in New Zealand, I think would apply to most regions of the world. When I think about systemic change, the first thing that I tried to do was rethink the way we see the role of partnerships. In here in Christchurch, New Zealand, the first major step that I thought about was introducing a partnership office. We call it the Office of Treaty Partnership. And it's a partnership office with our local Maori tribe. And this has allowed us to rethink the way we do things. The first thing is that we should not assume that we as universities are the experts in education. What the partnership has produced is thinking about changing access, but also reaching into the heart of the curriculum that the university offers. To think about or ask questions about whether the curriculum and how it's structured is culturally affirmative. Is it culturally alien to many students? And also to think about the change we wish to introduce from a strengths-based perspective rather than a deficit perspective. For too long, we've thought, well, the problem is at the school level, that there are gaps in the status of the knowledge of the incoming student, that they haven't got mathematics or a sufficient understanding of linguistic skills. They need better English in our case. And I think those assumptions need to be rethought. And we think about what the students are bringing in from a positive perspective. So an ecosystemic approach, I think, is needed. I think an approach with partnerships with communities, the very communities from which we're trying to draw more students, to think about what constitutes success and to ask ourselves some very deep questions about how we organize ourselves as universities, and some age-old assumptions about who can access university and what constitutes academic merit. Those are the issues I would like to discuss in this panel at this very important time. Thank you for the opportunity, Joanna, and I look forward to having a discussion with my co-panelists.
Well, thank you very much for that incredibly provocative and challenging and interesting start to looking at how the academy can be turned in some way around, and also the really strong emphasis on partnerships and challenging our own notions of what a university should be. I'd like to now turn to Kevin Hall, if I may, and ask you to answer the same question.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. And I think in your introduction, when you talked about universities being risk averse, I think what the pandemic has shown us, of course, is that we actually can be agile. And so we need to take that lesson and move forward with the agility that we've shown during the pandemic. I thought I'd touch on a few things we're doing at the University of Victoria and within the province of British Columbia. And first of all, it's really to start making our students become better global citizens, to be more aware of the inequities across this planet and what their role is in the future as future leaders to go out and make change. And so we're doing that through some of our programming, joint programs, joint degree programs that we're trying to get set up across the world. We're looking at transnational education opportunities for the delivery of UVic degrees in other countries, but also to give our students an opportunity to continue their studies offshore so that they learn a little bit more about the society that they're going to study in. And that also means increasing our mobility. In Canada, we have very low student mobility numbers. For whatever reasons, we're never too sure, but we're really starting to put some support behind mobility. Simple things like credit mapping, which is often an obstacle to students going overseas. We're also really trying to live the SDGs, and UVic is a university that was just ranked 12 in the world in the Times Higher Ed, which is a fantastic accomplishment for a small Canadian university. But we really do incorporate the SDGs into a lot of our programming, so both at the undergrad and the graduate level. We've established the United Nations Institutes for Training and Research, CFAL Center, just opened up in March, that we hope to connect our students through the CFAL network to like-minded individuals across the planet. And we're looking at networks. You know, how do we build partnerships, as Cheryl said, how do we build partnerships with like-minded institutions that have the same kind of ethics and ethos? Accessibility is a big issue for us, and I think there's two pieces to that. First is tech-enabled education, or, you know, we used to call it online or hybrid, but I truly think technology has the potential to impact the delivery of our education on a global platform. And so how do we embrace technology rather than just say it's online or it's face-to-face? And I think with that really looks at inequity in access to technology, both from a perspective of institutions. Universities, even within Canada, don't have the same ability to create the technology platforms. And then there's access to technology from the students themselves, and depending on their social economic status, you know, how accessible is broadband, how accessible is devices to actually deliver the education to. So we're trying to work on that front. I think it's our delivery as well, and the delivery of education I think is no longer in the domain of a content expert. It's now a team of technology experts, pedagogy experts, and the content expert, or the old professor, if you like, to actually deliver the best educational experience for our students. And so we're trying to really work on that. The accessibility issue is an interesting one also from the perspective of the age of students. And in Canada, most of our students are typically school leavers. It's about 90% at our university. So students coming out of high school directly. And then, you know, again, in Canada, 28% of people go to university. So the question is, what about the other 72%? And a lot of those are people that didn't finish high school, perhaps. And so how can we create enabling pathways for people in different walks of life to get access into a university? Because people can be quite successful not only when they leave high school, but in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to go back to university and study. So we're trying to look at that. And I guess that applies on a global platform as well. It's a Canadian problem that we're trying to deal with, but the same techniques and technology will work. And I thought I'd finish on reconciliation and decolonization. As it is in many countries around the world, it is the responsibility of our society to repatriate the land, to make our country a better place for Indigenous peoples to live in. And so we're working on decolonizing our institution. We've just appointed a vice president, Indigenous. She overlooks not only the educational delivery, but also the research environment, our purchasing and operations, our interactions with the community. And we're really working hard to decolonize our courses. We're working hard to decolonize our operations. We're working hard to decolonize the governance of our institution as we move forward towards reconciliation. The other piece for our Indigenous populations is the access piece. And we're actually, you know, have been invisible, if you like, in the K-12 system. And that's where universities need to start interacting to show students in our indigenous nations that education is really a game changer, and to get them excited about education at a very early level. So the university is very present now in the K-12 system. We've also created free tuition for our local First Nations, and we're looking at how we can expand that across the country. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so you've also laid out a really wide-ranging sort of expose on what needs to happen in universities, including, I mean, on the access point, I think we might come back to that in some of the questions, because there's a lot of rethinking to be done and challenging. And when you mentioned the curriculum, we might come back to that, because you've said that decolonisation as an initiative needs to be across the whole institution. So it needs to be the operations as well as the actual content that's being taught, and thinking about Cheryl's earlier point about partnerships and actually challenging ourselves to think about what is it that we think is wrong with the university, and what is it that others from outside the university think is wrong with the university. Yes. So thank you both for that. So I'm now going to go to Pamela, if I may, and ask you the same question.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And I also would like to add in thanking the ACU and the University of Victoria for putting together this very important discussion, and for having me as part of this very esteemed leadership in higher education. Actually, when I thought about this, I was thinking, when you talk about transformative change in higher education to a South African, you won't hear the end of it, because there's a lot to tell in terms of the drive as mandated really already at government level in terms of the legislative framework from the Higher Education Act, since the onset of the new democracy, to incorporating all of that with the Agenda 2063, for instance, and Sustainable Development Goals, as well as our National Development Plan. So there is a kind of a collective drive in the public higher education sector to bring about transformative change in higher education in South Africa. And then just coming to the UWC, our University of the Western Cape, where we have about 24,000 students, and about 43% of them dependent on financial aid, the National Financial Aid Scheme, and the fact that a number of our students come from, historically disadvantaged backgrounds. So to us, the drive to widen access for our students is very important. And the role that the university has in its ethos that's made it more closer to the community is the role that the university has played in the apartheid kind of struggle period. So when it comes to really my function in student affairs, just to make it easy, but we call it student development and support, I truly believe that we have an important role to play in educating for responsive and responsible democratic global citizenship, and to lay the foundations for lifelong learning and self-awareness, as well as in developing knowledge to advance the human condition. So even our university's Vision 2035 enjoins us to achieve these graduate attributes that we've put together in terms of our students, and they are echoed in our curriculum renewal discussions and in the programs that we do in the co-curricular space with students. So even our strategic plan, 2020, the recent one, actually 2021 to 2025, has 8 goals, and the first goal is really about student experience. And a whole lot has to do with the fact that we're very much aware of students as our greatest asset, and the fact that, student experience is very important. If students do not feel that they have equitable access to opportunities that we've talked about, the whole academic agenda can be disrupted. I mean, you talked about movements like, Black Lives Matter. In South Africa, we've had our share of forest movements, especially between 2015 and 2017. which made us really, while it brought about some very valid changes around free education and so on, among other things, it also made us very much aware of the importance of student experience and the importance of creating spaces for the diversity of voices of students. And during that period, because of the multiplicity of voices and lack of leadership during those protests, so we've had to look back into how then to reconnect, build bridges to be able to get students again to engage in healthy debates, to listen and to be able to practice their democratic rights as student leaders and also just in general as students. So some of the programs and experience learned from that period of the Fordist movement, where we had to quickly go also online and start doing hybrid kind of teaching, has been accelerated, of course, by the pandemic, where we've had to again be agile and go into online and hybrid learning. And it's been very challenging. I mean, the colleagues have already mentioned the inequality of access. That's been our major problem at our institution, the access to digital devices for students, to data, and so on. But we launched a project which is called No Student Left Behind. So every time I see this, it reminds me of our campaign where we really wanted to make sure that there is collective support, not just from within the institution, but also from our industry partners and sponsors and so on. So we've also really driven major game changer programs around student agency, that students also be part of finding solutions for their problems. Because again, the Fordist movement drove students very much into a demand culture, where everything that they need to be done by management has to be done now, and otherwise there will be havoc. So the whole student agency, getting students to think and find ways to find solutions to their problems. In my area, we've looked at incentives. SDGs are also very much incorporated in the drive, in the programs that we do, just to get students to think further than just their immediate demands. So issues of student well-being and student agency are very key in our work. And then workplace readiness and employability is something that we've had to think very seriously about, given, of course, the debates around 4IR, but also the agility that we've needed to undertake once the pandemic set on, and students were wondering now, is this the only way to carry on, to be only online? Because there's been a struggle with the hybrid part of it, and having students who are not vaccinated enter campus and so on. So workplace readiness has driven us also to come with a program that is an internship program for students who are unemployed, and for alumni who are still unemployed. And it's a program that just looks, it's an 18-month program that looks at making sure that we offer students opportunities within campus to work there, and it's part of also building our own timber. So I think I will stop there at this moment.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you for sort of leading on the student experience part. So, we've had a discussion about inequity and access, and actually thinking about what the models should look like in order to change the system, perhaps. But you've also talked very much about supporting students and supporting them through the change that an institution like the University of Western Cape has already gone through massive change through the apartheid and post-apartheid era, to a student community that are demanding change and then have to be led in some ways into a more partnership approach to how to change education. So thank you very much, that was wonderful. I'd now like to go to Julian, if I may, and ask you the same question. Julian.
Good morning for me, at least not for Cheryl, and to everybody here today in Barcelona. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Julian Skirm and I work at the University of Manchester, and thanks for the introduction. Just before I say a bit about what my own institution's been doing through this period, I just wanted to make a general point listening to what colleagues have said about the agility of the higher education system. All of us that work in it can find it frustrating. Sometimes the pace of change can be glacially slow, but I'd like to turn that on its head really, because we've talked a lot about changing the system of higher education, but our role, I think, is to try and change society. And the biggest impact we've had on society has been the pandemic, of course, in most of our lifetimes. The agility, certainly I'm sat here with 4 jabs, which I've had in my arm now, from a university down the road in Oxford in my country in the UK. The university where I work has done the most drug trials on COVID of any in Europe. So I think that's something universities, when we speak about our impact, rather than talk internally about our systems and processes, I think we need to be much more on the front foot and talk about the things that ordinary citizens have reason to value. And it's been the most disruptive thing that's happened in the world. It's the bit that's bound us all together as a whole globe. It's transcended nations as well. And I think that's something that I might talk a bit more about research, therefore, Joanna, rather than students, because that's been covered a bit. But I think that's such an important feature of universities, of how their research has been addressing the very real problems that people have faced in the past 2 to 3 years. So in terms of transformative then, in just the context of my own institution, we're in the UK's second city, you could argue, in Manchester. So we're about 200 miles away from London. And we're a very big research-intensive university, big in UK terms. We have around 44,000 students, 11,000 staff, around 500,000 alumni around the world. And 10 years ago, we set social responsibility as one of our core goals. So before the SDGs came along, we'd had this third goal. People can remember 3 things, so the other 2 are obvious: to do really world-class research, to have outstanding teaching and learning. Every university has those 2, but quite distinctively, we set social responsibility as this third goal. And that's meant it's set us on a particular journey, which the pandemic, I think, has only exacerbated rather than completely turned on its head. And really, I think social responsibility for us asks the question, not what are we good at, but what are we good for, in its most basic terms. What's the point of the university? What's our purpose? And our purpose isn't just to provide individual opportunities, it's to make a societal contribution to address the big social and environmental challenges through our research, through our teaching, and through our other functions. So the SDGs have been, as you know, Joanna, a big focus for us at Manchester, and in the 4 years since the Times Hires had their ranking, we've been the top 10 for each of those 4 years, and we're really proud of that. It says something about the breadth, and we make impact against all 17 SDGs because we're a very broad university. And just to pick up briefly on students, I think who we admit is really important. As Cheryl's mentioned, we've introduced what we call contextual data in the admissions process, where we give primacy to students who are disadvantaged and we give them an advantage. Therefore, we level that out in the process. We also think really carefully about how we develop our students, particularly introducing cross-disciplinary programs for students on SDGs. So whether you study medicine or Middle Eastern studies or microbiology or mathematics, you get the opportunity to address some of those big challenges. We've also introduced a living lab where external organizations can pitch real world problems linked to the SDGs, and students can do dissertations and pieces of work that are assessed, which address those big issues. I think in terms of, in Europe at least as well, with students, one of the things we've had to really quickly pivot to is, whilst COVID hasn't ended, we're over the worst of that, but as soon as we got over the worst of COVID, we've had a war in Europe, an invasion in Ukraine, and that's something that's displaced a lot of people. So we've been really thinking about the different types of displacement and what that means for student and staff mobility. And we very quickly put a £5 million new programme into some humanitarian scholarships for students who are displaced through their studies. So literally many universities have been bombed to the floor, and they're not going to quickly go back to study there. So there's a big challenge there in Europe. Through our research, though, there are big challenges that we've been addressing through the pandemic, the challenge of productivity, the challenge of the impact of COVID on older people, or the impact of COVID on Black and Asian people in the UK, which has been disproportionate. It's exacerbated existing health inequalities, the impact of COVID on young people's well-being, our research has really been quickly mobilised, and I think that's one of the advantages for me of the pandemic, how quick we've some internal processes around our research to be much more responsive. And just to echo something Cheryl said about how perhaps our comfort zone in universities is to dream up problems in the ivory towers of our universities and do things to communities. What we've particularly learned, and the internet has been wonderful for this, and Zoom, is how much easier it is to talk to the public very quickly and consult with people, and to take approaches using the concept of citizens' juries, citizens' panels, and working with the public to co-design issues and to listen much more rather than to talk, and to respond to very real issues. So there's a wonderful example in my university of a research programme which is leading the way, certainly in the UK, if not the world, on the problem of well-being post-pandemic for young people, the big challenge we've got coming out of the pandemic, of the effect this has had on young people and their learning. And we developed that programme through listening to young people. We thought, when we spoke to teachers, local teachers, that the biggest problem was catching up on all the learning that had been missed. That wasn't the biggest problem when we talked to people. The teachers were very confident that they had the experience to catch up. What they weren't confident about was the mental health and well-being implications of this. And just through listening and having a panel of young people, a panel of teachers to tell us this, quickly orientated what is now the leading project in the UK, and lots of external donors want to work and partner with us and fund this work to exacerbate the impact. And then finally, just how we operate as a university, I think, is really important. Partnerships, we've developed more of them during the pandemic, not less. We've used this as an opportunity to think about how we operate. So we've completely divested from fossil fuels, for example, in our university. We've ensured that we're paying above the minimum wages because there's a cost of living crisis in the UK now, and energy prices. And so that's something, paying a living wage above a minimum wage to all of our staff. We're a really big employer in our city and region, and we should never forget that. We're not just a learning institution. We're somewhere people earn money, with lots of non-academic roles, and people who in other sectors of the economy have much worse working conditions than you get in our university, and that's something we're really proud of. We also want to keep more money in our local economy. That's really important, and also address global issues like modern slavery through our supply chain. So how we operate as well in terms of transformation. We're really sizable organisations as universities in our cities and regions, and I think the way we think about our staff, our spending power, our role in placemaking in our cities and regions is really, really important. So I'll just pause there, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you for, although you said you were going to talk about research, and we're going to come back to that actually, and we're going to talk about impact of research and global challenges, because we haven't actually talked about that yet. We will come at that. One of the things that was striking to me was your sentence, what are we good for, not at, and the impact that universities have on citizens. And I think something that you've all said so far is about place. You know, you're talking about the place of the university in a local community and your partnerships there, but you're also thinking about internationalisation and the place of the university globally and what it's responsible for. So we might come back to those things. But I'm now going to welcome our fourth speaker, who is Tanshri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak. And if I could ask him to come to the stage. I was being told, sorry, I thought you told me that he was here. I thought, okay, in that case, we're not. It's just you communicating with me, so I thought that's what you were communicating. I can't actually hear you. So apologies for that. If you want to let me know something, put it in a note, and then I will be able to respond. Thank you. Okay, so we're not going to go for our fourth speaker. I'm now going to move on to another question, and also we have got questions in the audience. I'm going to bring them in soon. But I wanted to say that, you know, it's all very well, but we have Victoria, University of Western Cape, Canterbury, Manchester universities. How do people from the outside see the changes that you are making as transformative leaders? You know, because the question I was going to ask is what advice can you give to other leaders who want to bring about transformative change, and what are the obstacles? So, you know, how are we going to see the changes that you're making as transformative leaders? And if I may go first to Pamela on that question.
Thank you very much, Joanna. You know, the impact of what is done usually would be felt in the communities through the research, discussions on what impact the research has done. But if I have to talk about my area in particular, it's just us making sure that our students are continuously engaged also with the, with the locations within which the university is based. So the kind of outreach programs, civic engagement in terms of outreach programs that the students do, work even on campus through, for instance, the newly established campus, re-established campus radio, because it was banned during apartheid years, so we've had to revive that. Also connect students to the community, the kind of discussions that they have. And so that's how you also get the, the feedback from the community in and the excitement from the surrounding communities on whatever the university achieves. When it's graduations and their participation in graduation, when it's sports, their participation as spectators, and their support. So it might not always be, in terms of, numbers, quantitative kind of measurements to say that when it comes to student experience and civic engagement, this is how well we are doing in terms of, numbers and measures, but the quality of feedback that we get, and we make sure also that we do get some qualitative kind of feedback from the partners that we work with, not just in the surrounding communities, but also within our international partnerships and strategic partnerships locally. So I really do think that as much as there's a lot of talk about universities losing, the trust from the communities in terms of what they stand for, in terms of being seen as elitist and so on. I think that's, it really depends in which area and what the engagement has been like with those communities, because I really believe, especially the COVID pandemic and how researchers in universities and experts within universities have been at the forefront of, guiding the communities or the public in terms of where things are and what is happening from their expertise. And I think that trust is slowly really also being regained, and I think we can leverage on that as institutions.
Thank you, Pamela. So trust and partnerships is really key. Julian, can I come to you next for the University of Manchester? How are the Mancunians around you, but also in the broader UK and the world, seeing the changes that you're instigating in the institution?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you're saying, first of all, in the question around about how other leaders want to bring about transformative change, what obstacles need to be overcome, what advice could we give to other leaders? And I think I'd always look at universities as these amazing institutions that are also incredibly frustrating in terms of change. But sometimes looking back at things that we've done that have stuck, and that includes more recently as well as, over time, and I've worked at my university for quite a while now, so you see which bits of change, transformative change, really sticks. Universities have a culture, and that exists of our values and our norms in its most simple terms. We're value-driven organisations, as we've all demonstrated already in some of the things we talk about. But I prefer to sort of attack the norms of our universities for transformative change. And by that, I mean, our values will always be contested. We can put them into vision statements and strategies in our universities to try and get people behind them. But our job in universities is to be cynical, is to be critical, is to pull things apart, is to contest the meaning of things. We have lots of clever people who will never agree. So if you try and get full consensus to have transformative change in a university, you'll be these institutions that be accused of never changing, having this glacial pace, being out of touch, etc. And I think many universities do find themselves in that space because of the incredibly democratic ways in which we're run, where we value lots of different perspectives. That is a challenge, though. And ultimately, for me, transformative change comes from changing those norms, changing our really boring stuff, our processes, our policies. So I gave an example earlier about students on contextual data. We had a huge debate in the university around which indicators we would use to define what disadvantage meant. Can you imagine the different perspectives we had on that from our academics? Then we had a debate about, well, if we were going to adjust the grades for students who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, by how much should we adjust that? If we were going to do that, how would we evaluate it? And we could have debated these things for 50 years. Ultimately, though, you have to make a decision and change your policies. And when you change your policies, of course, we can adapt those and evaluate them over time. But that's the thing, that in terms of transformative change, people quickly fall behind a norm in universities and follow a process. And that's the biggest thing I've learned about transformative change, that yes, we need to have these very open, rigorous debates reflecting the amazing culture we have of different perspectives. But we also then need to get behind institution-wide policies. We're really good at saying, well, this department can do this, that department can do that, and we've all got 1,000 different ways of doing things. And we appear really out of touch to the public and also to policymakers and businesses and other people we want to partner with. So I think having quite bold institution-wide policies, even if they're not perfect, that's what changes those norms. There's really quite boring things of writing things down and agreeing that you follow these processes and policies. So attacking the norms, changing the norms rather than the values, for me, is how you do transformative change. And that supersedes things. And if I got run over by a bus or my president did, those things continue. And we've got many programs that have lasted 10, 15, 20 years that are transforming things on an annual basis because they don't rely on any charismatic individual or any person's particular perspective, but they're written into our very fabric of our institution.
Thank you for that, Julian. Thank you for reminding us that systemic change needs to have, needs to actually have, looking at those indicators, for example, of disadvantage, and then applying that analysis to the whole of the university approach is going to create the kind of systemic change that, for example, in the UK, there's something called the Athena Swan programme, which was actually to looking at the disadvantage female scientists had initially. That was the programme, and what systemic change needed to happen to support female careers in science. And in fact, your Vice-Chancellor is a perfect example of a scientist who went through the ranks at Manchester and became Vice-Chancellor there. Could I now turn to Kevin?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. Great question, and I think we often as institutions overestimate the impact the community feels, because we tend to use our own set of metrics. We tend to run our own discussions, and we tend to chase the rankings that we choose to chase and submit our own data. And I think we really have to start having a better conversation with the community. We need to talk with the community rather than to the community. We need to really assess, what is impact and how is it created. And I'll just reflect on a really great workshop I attended in the last few days here with the UNESCO chairs. And it was a conglomeration of, let's say, 50 academics talking about the impact they've had on community-engaged research. And what struck me is there's nobody from the community here to tell the story. How's it impacted them directly? So we can all talk about the publications we've put into learned journals, about the reports we've given to the communities, but we don't really ever talk very deeply to the community and say, how is this impacting you? We're finding in Victoria, if we go out, there's individual researchers doing some amazing work within the community, but if you ask people about their sense of the university and the community, we're not present. We're known as the institution that is behind a ring road or a moat, and so we need to create those porous boundaries to have people come in and out. We need to make sure we go into the communities ourselves to work a lot better. We need to do things with the communities, and so one of the things I love about the model of the CFAO from the United Nations is it's not just about the university. We have our municipalities around the university as co-signatories, so we're all doing something together around the SDGs. We've put an anti-racism ambassador out in our community, which is predominantly white, so the university is paying for this, but it's actually working to change attitudes within the community itself. And I guess the last piece is really about that continual sense of talking with as opposed to the community, and using the language of the community with the community to assess how we're doing.
So you're kind of challenging yourselves by bringing in the community and giving them a chance to have voice, which they wouldn't have had otherwise. So you're not just telling them what you're doing, you're actually asking them on the impact, and yet you're still there up in the rankings in terms of a research-intensive university. And I will come to that and ask about widening participation and the tensions between that and all those policies and having a very strong research impact. Cheryl, can I ask you how your transformations in universities and your experience, how they will be looked at perhaps?
Thanks, Joanna. I think there are two issues that I'd like to pick up on, and I'd summarize them as purpose and place. Starting off with purpose, I think it's really important that we ask ourselves on a regular basis, what is our purpose? Why do we exist? And earlier on, Julian talked about what are we good for as a question, which I think is really about what is the purpose of higher education? What is the purpose of higher education in society? The panelist spoke about rankings, and I don't think we should conflate rankings with an answer to the question of purpose. So if I look at the question of purpose, we often think about higher education as a public good. And at the University of Canterbury, in our 10-year plan, we've expressed that as through the concept of engagement, which I think, Julian, would be akin to social responsibility, which you articulated earlier on from your institutional perspective. But we then have to ask another question more deeply. What do we mean by public good, and which public? Whose publics? And how are we seen from those perspectives? And as Kevin said, not just measured in our own terms. So with respect to the University of Canterbury, the concept of engagement is deeply linked to the understanding of place, because I'm very conscious as the Vice-Chancellor that we inhabit a place that not so long ago didn't belong to us. And in fact, in New Zealand as a bicultural nation, or as a country with a constitution about biculturalism, we have a partnership with Manu Whenua in Te Reo Māori, but that is people of the land, which is our local Māori tribe. And the way we've structured that as a partnership is that I work with the leader of the local tribe and meet every 3 weeks with the local leader and really see that leadership responsibility, and having discussions about key issues facing the university at a very early stage, so that we think about partnership in an authentic way, and that we think about co-creation over key matters. So the sense of place is, to me, related to the sense of purpose. And when we're talking about the SDGs, and perhaps one of the crises of our time being climate change, the climate crisis, while there's a lot of scientific knowledge that our universities have produced, there's an urgent need for more research at the local level to understand the level of threat, to understand the impact of disaster, and to think about ways of building resilience and mitigation. So that's where research and place come together as well with purpose. Then we could think about perhaps in relation to that, two other P's that I think Julian mentioned, and that's our policies and procedures. And policies and procedures might seem boring, but it's in the policies and procedures that we begin to understand what many of our critics mean about an accumulative impact of everyday racism or everyday sexism, and how, in terms of how we arrange ourselves, we are perhaps not inclusive enough to our local communities. So another set of P's that I think is worth looking at, perhaps from an internal perspective, but it does have an impact on the other two P's, which are about purpose and place, which go to the heart of the transformative impact of higher education. And that's really the purpose of higher education, is its transformative impact. And yes, in our panel, we we're speaking quite critically, but let us do remind ourselves that higher education is transforming lives, and I see it in our local community. We've introduced a whole new way of looking at student experience, as we've talked about earlier in the panel, and we're seeing success. And we know that when a young person who is first in family accesses a university education, it has a multiplier effect in our communities. And so our institutions have the potential, we are transformative, but we should not take that as a given. It's something that we have to keep asking ourselves. Are we responsive enough in terms of our purpose in changing times in relation to the SDGs? And can we see ourselves and measure ourselves as being responsive enough and purposeful enough in terms of our responsibility to place in the past, in redressing past wrongs in our local communities, but also thinking about a more sustainable and inclusive future.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And I'm just thinking, as I've been listening to all our panelists speak, that you've got the transformative nature of higher education in its own right through the subject areas that students study and then go on to have that multiplier effect. But you also have all the issues that you've drawn attention to in terms of how higher education has been and how it needs to change in order to have that purpose that's understood and supported, I think, by local and international communities. So I'd now like to open the floor to questions, and I think you've also all mentioned rankings at various times in the discussion. And I think the first question is from Tim Sorolla of the Times Higher Impact Ranking. So Tim, if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you. Do I need a microphone? Yes. Thank you very much, and to all the panelists for this really, really interesting discussion. My question possibly actually has been answered a bit already since I put my hand up, but I did just want to ask if you could reflect a bit more. I mean, it's incredible to hear and inspiring to hear about all the fantastic new work that you've been doing and the changes you've been implementing. But I wondered if you could reflect, are there any practices or policies that you really realized were no longer appropriate and have had to abandon as part of your transformation, and how do you deal with that? What were the, did you get challenging sort of blowback, as it were, from stakeholders who didn't want you to make those changes?
Thank you, great question. Who'd like to answer that first? Pamela, I think, has put her hand up, and then Cheryl, Julian, if you want to sort of just give me a signal if you want to answer that. Pamela.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was reminded of that when Julian was talking about policies and so on, because I had to chair really in a very urgent manner policies review around sexual harassment. And because what we had already on campus was seen as outdated and not practical and not implementable in a way that, the developments in society and within higher education in particular needed to talk to. And it was quite an exciting but very vexing exercise because of the variety of voices that were coming. And at first it was, do we do that just for students or also for staff members? But when it comes to staff members, also there are some kind of labor law and other legislative framework that talk to the needs for staff members. So we needed to end up doing it just only for students. But there are so many developments, even in just using terminology, the politically correct terminology in an exercise like that. But I think for me, what was important was the research work that went into it, making sure that there are surveys, there's student feedback, there's student engagement around the policy, but also bringing in surrounding communities, because they also are very much aware of some of the incidents that would happen on students when they go, in transport and so on, just to also hear their voices, because we know that issues of they go beyond the walls of the universities. So I thought I would just mention that. And part of that work also then, especially around the pandemic period, also called for doing a mental health and wellness policy. And again, that was the same kind of issue. Staff or students, or just students, or how far do you go, and what are the immediate needs, and what it is that you want to regulate if you're saying policy, and what it is that you can offer and are able to offer, even in terms of the resources that you have as a university. That's the type of examples that I think I can share at the moment.
Thank you, and I'll come to you, Kevin, in a second. But I think it's really interesting because it goes back to that point about systemic change needing to happen and not relying on charismatic leaders. And so the lessons that you've learned from the way that you approach the student and staff, or student not staff, is probably something which then becomes policy in the university and can be followed through. Kevin?
I just thought I'd add that, transformation or systemic change is often seen internally by the community as extra work. Oh no, we can't do this. Now you're just adding to our workload. And one of the things that we're terrible at universities is looking at a stop, start, continue analysis. So what do we actually stop? Because if we start all these new things, it's important we get rid of the old practice. And so it just becomes part of the culture of an institution if you want transformation, to start looking at what you stop in addition to what you add. And the second piece to that, for me, is around the revenue piece. We are in Canada, we are government-funded institutions to about 45% of our total revenue. The rest comes from student fees, primarily, a little bit from philanthropy, not much. And that means we just live from year to year with a incremental budget, which means we don't have a lot of money to invest strategically into some of these things that really matter to us. And so we have to start looking at how do we diversify our revenue at a university, and that's a big role for the leadership at the institution. Do we extend ourselves beyond our comfort zone? Do we start looking at our land assets, for example, and looking at public-private partnerships to address some of the issues that occur in our community? Housing is a huge issue for us in Victoria. The cost of housing is one of the most expensive in Canada. And so for people that live and work in the community, access to affordable housing is a big issue. So can we use some of our assets to work to build cheaper housing? And in doing so, also generate a bit of a revenue stream that we can invest in some of these fantastic things that we want to do. So I think we've got to attack it from a number of perspectives.
Universities as innovative agents of change then as well. And of course, universities can do amazing things because they do have this estate and they do have this income as well as the challenges that comes with it. So can I, Cheryl or Julian, would either of you like to have a go at this question? Cheryl?
Well, I think one of the areas that I'd like to highlight is the use of technology, and particularly data analytics, and how that has been quite a powerful instrument for showing us where we need to change. So by using data analytics, we have been able to identify things that don't work. That for many years people have thought are good things, and we've invested more resources into them. And looking at the data and taking into consideration questions like, do the students use it? How often are they using it? The service, and then finding out more from a qualitative perspective what's going on. We've been able to redirect resources to areas that matter, as opposed to dispersing resources across a number of programs or interventions that were assumed to be good and helpful. But when we looked at the evidence and the patterns of utilization, it turned out not to be the case. So I think technology and the power of data analytics has been from really a point or a lever for transformation, and allows us to address some of these persistent inequities that we've been talking about on this panel. So, for example, we were able to begin to understand that by week 3 of quarter 1, 2/3 of the students face fear of failure and start questioning, is this really for me? And start experiencing self-doubt And then once we understood that is a major issue, as I said, we could mobilize resources, focus the resources in order to address that particular issue. And then if you go to the second quarter of an academic cycle, the issues are different. And with the power of data and data analytics, we're now able to understand that much better than ever before and to be much more agile and flexible in how we respond.
Thank you. Julian, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. What do we stop doing? We invent lots of new things. It's almost impossible to close down a research institute in our university once you establish one and everyone gets a director, a social media person, and you name it, and you build up more and more of these. We've got around 30 research institutes. But one of the things that pandemic has taught us, though, because we had to work more collaboratively, there's 5 higher education institutions in the city region of Greater Manchester. So it's around 3 million people in Greater Manchester. 5 higher education institutions, around 110,000 students between us as a group of 5. And working together, what we've learned, what did we stop doing is trying to solve everything ourselves as individual institutions. We're terrible at this in higher education because our governance processes don't align with each other. So you can end up in a situation where you feel really guilty as a university that you're not responding to a societal challenge, where actually the university next door is much more capable of addressing that. It's just nobody's thought to speak collectively. So we set up during the pandemic something called a Civic University Agreement, which was the 5 universities, the 5 vice-chancellors, with the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. And we signed up and we did surveys with the public about what they wanted from our universities. We looked at the leadership priorities in our city region. We looked at the capacity and capabilities of our 5 different universities, which are extremely diverse. You know, we're a member of the Russell Group of research intensive universities, but we've got universities in our city region that are much better than we are in certain disciplines and more teaching focused, recruit more local students than we do. And between us, we can cover almost any challenge we feel if we act as one. So we signed up to the Civic University Agreement, and it's meant we're not reinventing wheels. So we have a shared program to work with SMEs and charities around upskilling and professional development. We have a shared approach to thinking about the productivity challenges. We've got a shared approach around student mental health. We employ our own psychiatrists and psychologists to have a triage service for students, which has been in a partnership with our local National Health Service. So we're doing things together that previously we would have done on our own. And I think that's a much smarter way to think about how we operate across our cities and regions. And when we speak to local people, that's what drives it. They don't care, actually, our local people, which university it is specifically is addressing that issue. They think about higher education as a sector. And these games of top trumps we all play in terms of rankings and status and size and mission. And actually, the general public in our city region, they don't think like this, of course. They have health challenges. They've got kids to take to school. They've got jobs to secure. And for us working together, that's one of the best ways I think that we can serve our cities and regions is much more partnership work. It's cheaper. It allows you to stop things, which is the question. But more importantly, it's what the public want.
Thank you. And I think a final question, if I may, is we've been talking a lot about place and we've been talking a lot about transformative changes that can happen within the institution through working in partnership, through having discussions with local communities, through systemic change in processes. We haven't really talked globally that much. And in some sense also, Julian, you just mentioned, you know, universities have their own drivers. Universities have students who have parents who want them to go to universities with an international community, with a research impact. Quite often, let's take Manchester, it has a very strong research profile. All the universities here do in different areas. So how do you create change from the traditional modes, perhaps, of recruitment and international students and international partnerships into working collaboratively with partners to better address global challenges, perhaps in the research space? And if I don't know who wants to go for that. Whoever puts their hand up first. I'm looking at the screen and I'm looking.
I'll have a go to start if you want. I think traditionally, you know, a university like mine, we have a huge number of Chinese students, for example, and that's been growing and that will continue, you know, because of the forces of economics and aspiration. I think what's more difficult, but what's something we're really proud of at Menster, is trying to completely invert that model and think which parts of the world really could benefit in terms of their stage of development from particular partnerships with the university, and trying to flip this model of higher education being about individual social mobility towards the power of education to support sustainable development in those countries. So we introduced a program 15 years ago at Menster called the Equity and Merit Program, which is tied now to the Sustainable Development Goals. And by talking to, so it's just targeted, at countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's in Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda principally, though it's been expanded more recently to Ethiopia. That program was developed in partnership. So it was us working with local NGOs, and it was targeted at master's level, because if we did it at undergraduate level, this is something that could have caused a brain drain from those countries, because students might not return or take those skills back very quickly. And we only offer programs in areas that are not available in country, and we only take students whose intention is to go back to those countries straight after a one-year master's program. So this program, we've produced government ministers, health officials, business people, people addressing sustainable development of dams in their countries on big infrastructure projects, engineering projects. And I think that partnership, being really mindful of when we think about the world and sustainable development, global student mobility, it means different things in different parts of the world. So that context-specific approach to looking at your global footprint, because Manchester, we're really blessed that people from all around the world would love to come to the UK. But there's a real responsibility when you undertake that work around which incentives, because the program I've described is free for students. Our donors fund this. We write off the fees, and our donors fund fully the living costs and flights for those students. So it's a tremendous opportunity, but we've tried to turn that from a discourse previously we used to use of individual social mobility of that person, as important as that is, by the way, to that person, their family, but more about the skills they will take forward for their nation, for their communities.
Thank you, and that ties in very well with many of the mobility programs that have been talked about at this conference, where the requirement is either to go back at the end of the study or to actually do a split site or distance learning. Kevin, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we have to understand that within our own institution, or our solar system, if you like, we need to connect up research, student experience, teaching, alumni, industry, government relations. They're all interconnected, and they all create opportunities for the university and for the receptors of the university. So I think that's, critical that we all do that. As universities, we tend to want to partner up to boost our research using traditional metrics around publications and lift our university up in the so-called rankings we've been talking about. But equally as important, we need to look at where we can help build capacity, where we can create opportunities globally. And I think the student space is a really interesting one now because of the pandemic and perhaps the change in the way students learn, the way students are going to come to certain countries. Canada has been particularly focused on bringing international students into Canada, but I think we're now looking at transnational education opportunities, which is already going on around the world. The Brits and the Australians are great at TNE, but how do we establish a presence in different countries? How do we partner on delivering joint degrees in situ in other countries? And those will lead into research collaborations, they'll lead into problem solving, and they'll lead into sharing local knowledge that we develop in our community in Victoria with other communities that have similar types of problems around how do we change the social or economic or environmental context of people that live in these cities. And I think there's room for all of those types of partnerships. And I think universities just have to go into these not looking at it as what's in it for me, but what's in it for the receptors.
Cheryl, do you want to come in here?
Thanks, Joanna. I think just looking back at the pandemic, of course, we're not out of it yet. What it has really brought to our attention across the globe is how interconnected our lives are, where, something happens somewhere else, but it has a significant impact on our daily lives. So we are deeply interconnected in ways that we perhaps hadn't imagined prior to the pandemic. But one of the consequences of the pandemic is that it's perhaps pushed us into more local ways of thinking, sometimes in not the most helpful way, especially in cases where borders have been closed. And fortunately, we're now in a space, due to the contribution our scientists have made, where we're rethinking the importance and the positive impact connection across geographic regions has. So we're looking forward to the return of our international students, because what our international students bring to our campus is perspectives and ways of thinking that we otherwise just are not exposed to. And, you know, the lockdown period really brought that home. On the one hand, how interconnected we are. On the other hand, how we miss and how we value that interconnection and what those opportunities bring. And yes, technology has been fantastic in sustaining the networks that we're part of. But what we have learned is how our relationships and interconnections can be sustained through multiple means, through use of technology, like in this platform, on this panel, but also the importance of human connection in person. So I think we really have an exceptional opportunity to think about the importance of internationalization, and perhaps doing it in a more sustainable way than we did it in the past, particularly as we think about the climate change challenges. But there's no doubt, as democracy comes under threat in various ways, that we need that sense of connection across cultures, across ethnic groups, across nationalities. So I remain deeply convinced that internationalization is absolutely at the heart of the transformative power of university education.
Thank you, Cheryl. Pamela.
Thank you very much. I also totally agree that internationalization is part and parcel of the transformation agenda. Our challenge in South Africa in general, and especially at my university, has been really more outward mobility for our students to go outside the country, especially because it tends to happen at postgraduate level, and there tends to be demands in terms of family and domestic commitments, and so students find it difficult to leave the country for a certain period of time. So what we've tried to do is to encourage more internationalization at home, working with existing partnerships, especially long-standing partnerships. We've had a long-standing partnership of 30 years with the Missouri system, you know, in the US, and we've just expanded on that also by including partners from Belgium. And so again, looking at sustainable ways of internationalization at home, bringing in some of our partners to work with our students and staff members, and also to have these, you know, kind of two-way kind of exchanges where it's structured. The student would go for a certain period to our partner university and so on. So it's not that they don't go at all, but at least a lot of work gets done online and in engagements before they even get to the physical location at our partner institutions. Joint degrees are also becoming really topical for us as ways of trying to make sure that internationalization happens. And of course, our participation in associations like the ACU and advancing the SDGs. Just yesterday, I was in a talk with the University of Bergen, which is also providing incentives for more collaboration with partners by advancing SDGs as, you know, as the themes to look at. And we are part of that also as a university because of our partnership with the University of Bergen. So it's very much, yeah, the bilaterals and multilaterals that we do with our partner institutions, as well as looking at associations that we can work with. We're looking, for instance, at MasterCard Foundation because we want to grow our, you know, number of, especially postgraduate students from the rest of the continent. We get, you know, we've got about 21% of our student enrollment is postgraduate students, and almost half of that is from really the continent, and we want to grow more of our postgraduate numbers, and we're looking then at partnerships such as that to support the funding.
Thank you. So we are deeply interconnected, and thank you very much for that reminder that the Association of Commonwealth Universities, all international networks are there to actually connect and support higher education and its transformative impact. I would like to thank the University of Victoria. I'd like to thank UNESCO for bringing this panel together. And I would like to say thank you to our panelists and close this session. So thank you all very, very much.